very happy to be here this evening, and I have the pleasure, I'm with the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, and I have the pleasure of introducing both of our speakers. They're going to be sharing the presentation, so I'll just introduce them both right now. So first up is Tommy Cleveland, and up until very recently, he worked with us at the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center for 10 years as the Renewable Energy Program Coordinator, where he did many things, but including helping take a leadership role in developing a model template solar ordinance for a template for a model solar ordinance that involved 70 stakeholders across the state. And this spring, he left us to work at Advance Energy, a nonprofit on the Centennial campus of NC State. So he has over 10 years of experience in solar and has got his undergraduate as well as his MS in mechanical engineering at NC State University, and he is a professional engineer, and currently he's working, I think I mentioned, at Advance Energy, a nonprofit nearby us. And the second speaker is Steve Kalland, and he's the director of the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, and we're part of NC State University, part of the College of Engineering. Steve's been the executive director since 2007, and before that, he has over 23 years of experience in renewable energy and energy efficiency, particularly with regards to solar. He was served as a past board member of the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, IREC, NC Green Power, and the Advisory Board for Environmental and Energy Study Institute. He also was the previous executive director of the Maryland, DC, and Virginia Solar Energy Industries Association, and he is a graduate of the College of William and Mary in Virginia. And in 1993, he received a Master's of Science in Public Policy Analysis from the University of Rochester in New York. And that's it. So glad you could join us today. I'm going to pass it over to, Tommy, are you up first?
I got
you got your mic. Okay, we're all good.
So I'm going to kick us off, and I'm Steve Kalland, and thank you for that. And again, thanks to all the folks with Co-op Extension and with the county down here that have invited us to come down. Glad to see we've got some folks here that are interested. I think, give you just a little background. We've been doing a kind of roadshow at this point around solar energy issues for a while now. This is our maybe 10th county.
Good. I was going to say 10 as well. That's
yeah,
good.
So it's probably in the neighborhood. 10th county that we've been in to do some of this work and try and get more information out there about kind of both the myths and the realities around renewable energy issues. So today we're going to talk, just briefly, I'll talk a little bit about NCC Tech, which is our organization. I'll talk about Tommy's actually going to talk about the basics of what is solar. I'll talk a little bit about the North Carolina solar market and how we got to where we are today. I'll talk a little bit about some of the positive impacts of solar, and then Tommy's going to walk us through some of the common concerns that we've heard in various forums. And we'll walk through this list of common concerns by topic. We'll talk about a couple of other information resources, and then we'll answer what questions we can. So that's kind of the general agenda. Briefly, the Clean Energy Technology Center. Who's here is an NC State grad, by the way? Anybody? Boy, we got to work on that. At any rate, NC State has been engaged in this space for clean energy for a long time. The Clean Tech Center is actually was renamed to the Clean Tech Center about 5 years ago now. We used to be the North Carolina Solar Center, which many of us know us as. Actually, back in the day, Senator Bass Knight had a hand in helping to create some of the early funding that made the center possible way back when. But the center, which was founded in '88, actually goes all the way back to the solar house, which was constructed on campus in 1981. So NC State has a long history in this space. It goes all the way back to the energy crises of the 70s and trying to respond to that, and that's kind of where we come from. We are part of the College of Engineering at NC State, so my boss is the Associate Dean for Research in the college. He does look at me every now and then and wander around in the halls muttering under his breath about why he's got this policy guy reporting to him, but in general, the philosophy of the center and increasingly the philosophy around all technology issues is that there's really three legs to every stool. There's the technology issue, but there's also the economics issues and the policy issues. And really, you have to kind of bring those three legs of the stool together to get anything done, certainly in the world of energy and in many other technology fields. And so those pieces are all important, and the fact that I exist is testament to the fact that NC State has acknowledged that. Our funding comes in various forms. We get a little bit of money. This year it's a very little money from the North Carolina General Assembly, but we have seen an ebb and flow in that money over the years. The vast majority of our funding comes from federal contract work that we do with the Department of Energy. We'll see how that goes as we move forward. But we also do some fee-for-service work, and we do work with foundations. So it's a broad mix of funding that supports the center. And just to be clear, there are a lot of centers at NC State that are research centers that are working on, if I move this molecule from here to here, it changes the absorptive properties of this material from this to this. That's not us. We are on the extension and engagement side. I'm assuming that most of you are vaguely familiar, at least, with the whole three legs of the land-grant university system. So there's a big piece that's research, there's a big piece that's education, but there's the third piece, which Cooperative Extension is the flagship for, which is kind of basically functioning as the technology transfer mechanism to get things from the ivory towers out into the real world. And so we're a part of the College of Engineering's piece of that extension and engagement mission, and we're very, very pleased, as I said, to be partnering with Cooperative Extension over in the College of Ag and Life Sciences to help get the word out on this stuff. Just quickly, we cover an array of technologies. Renewable energy is a big piece of what we do, solar, wind, and bioenergy in particular. I was just at a directed biogas discussion with a bunch of hog farming people just recently, so we do work in a pretty different array of technologies. Clean power and energy efficiency, that's a lot of distributed generation, microgrids, combined heat and power or cogeneration systems, so big kind of industrial energy efficiency type activities. Clean transportation, we mostly work with fuels and with vehicles, so electric vehicles, propane and gas vehicles. We do work with biofuels as well, ethanol, and also biodiesel. And then green building technologies, basically the whole conversation around things like LEED for homes or LEED buildings. We're involved in a lot of those spaces around kind of better practices to save energy, save water, and improve the efficiency and therefore improve the economics of construction. We do that work, kind of in these four cross-cutting areas: economic development, energy policy, workforce development. We do a lot of training and continuing education work. So we periodically have done training down here in Dare County on wind energy issues as well as on solar issues. We haven't got one scheduled lately, but I'm sure that there'll be one in the not too distant future. And then education, general education and outreach, everything from working with K through 12 STEM education to training community college instructors to incorporate renewables into their curriculum. So a pretty wide gamut. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tommy to start talking about some of the technology issues here.
All right, thank you. I'm going to try to give an introduction to solar technologies, focusing on the kind of solar that North Carolina has mostly seen, but also giving a little background on some other topics. And as Steve said earlier, we're going to plan on leaving plenty of time for questions and answers toward the end, because we're not sure quite what folks are interested in, what your questions are. So we'll cover some of the basics here and then take your specific questions later. But if you've got a question or want to clarify something, you can feel free to stop me as I'm talking through this. Solar technology can be put in several different buckets. Most simply, passive solar, just letting sunlight come into a building in the wintertime, and then when it's higher in the sky, having shade structures to keep it from coming inside the building in the summertime. Solar electric, down the middle there, which is what we're talking about today and mostly what's happening in North Carolina. The version of that that's happening in North Carolina is circled there, photovoltaics, or I'll usually just say PV for photovoltaics, where you're converting sunlight directly into electricity. And then on the right side is solar thermal. Usually you're heating water in those applications, maybe for home use or maybe for commercial or industrial use. And then down at the bottom of the screen, there's a couple of technologies that are kind of in between solar electric and solar thermal. They're big concentrating systems that produce really high temperature oil that then converts that high temperature heat into electricity. It runs through a big steam turbine to make electricity. And we're not seeing those anywhere in the East Coast. There are some of those systems out in the the western, more arid parts of the U.S. and some around Europe. But most of where the solar industry is going, really around the world, is toward that circle technology, the photovoltaics. It's a technology that was invented in the mid-50s. The price has been coming down since then, and technology has been improving since then. But the basic technology was actually built for the first time in the mid-50s. You can take those same basic components, the same solar panel, and use them in three different kind of systems: a residential system, commercial system, or primarily what North Carolina has seen as a utility scale system, where they're on racks mounted on the ground. So most of what I'm going to talk about is that utility scale system, and kind of talk about what is in the project, what's installed there, how does it work, what does it do. Steve's going to talk a little bit after me of why do we see so many utility scale systems in North Carolina and not so many of the residential and commercial systems. It's really an economic, a little bit of a policy driven situation, but Steve will explain that a little more. This is an aerial view of a pretty typical utility scale system in North Carolina. They come in different sizes, but the most common size has a 5 megawatt capacity, which means under the right conditions, it can produce 5,000 kilowatts or 5 million watts of electricity. The way these are connected, they run right out to the street, and they essentially plug into the existing utility lines that are running down that street, just on the wooden utility poles. So whenever the sun's shining on this, it's producing electricity that just taps into that local line, and it means the folks using electricity off that line are getting power from that solar system, and the larger generating plants elsewhere in the grid see that reduction of demand, so they burn less, in most cases burn less natural gas or burn less coal, because that solar is generating at that moment. As you can see, most of what's there are just rows and rows of solar panels, but there are a few places that may be kind of hard to see from the image here. Looks like little kind of white spots, and that's some little pads, concrete pads, where there's an inverter and a transformer that converts the electricity made from the panels, converts it into electricity that matches up with the grid, so it can be shipped out from those transformers right into the grid. And I've got some images to show a little bit more about each of those components. Some of the systems in North Carolina now are, some of them are close to 20 times this big. There's some that are at least 15 times this big in North Carolina, some that are about 75 megawatts. So this is a single 5 megawatt project. There's around 300 of these in North Carolina of this scale now. And then a number that are quite a bit bigger. There's a couple of different basic panel technologies or photovoltaic technologies that are available in the market today. The most common is silicon panel, which was the original design in the mid-50s. They're almost 20% efficient, which means that about 20% of the solar energy that hits them comes out as electricity. They're very durable, and they've been in the field now for over 30 years, the same basic technology. So we know what happens when they're out in the field that long. They have very few failures within the 30-year time period. And they slowly degrade each year. So they start out producing 20%, something like 20% efficient. After 25 years, they still produce about 80% of what they originally produced. And there's a power warranty that the manufacturers provide that say that. It's a 25-year power warranty. So there's good confidence that the panels last a long time and produce power for a long time. I can quickly walk through what those layers are. You can see it's exploded out view here to show the layers. Most of the weight is in those top two layers. It's a tempered glass cover and an aluminum frame. Together is something like 80% of the weight of the panel. Then those other layers are all protecting that black layer. That's the actual silicon cells that produce the electricity. It's maybe 3 or 4% of the weight of the panel are the silicon cells. Everything else is just there to protect the cells and keep them dry over that 30-year period, encapsulating plastic layers to keep moisture away from those cells. And then little bits of wire to connect all those cells electronically or electrically to then have an output. All those components are recyclable. Currently, when these panels get broken during construction or transport, you've always got some fraction of the tens of thousands of panels being installed. Those panels are now, from my interviews with most of the developers in the state, being recycled. It's easy to take off that aluminum frame and recycle the aluminum frame. It's easy to take off the few feet of copper wire that come off the back and recycle that. Then the rest of this currently gets recycled along with the glass and plastic from crushed cars. So they're recycling out some large fraction of that glass and then recycling the energy from some of that plastic, essentially burning that plastic in a large scale way to produce electricity in a big incinerator. To put in perspective how much power they produce, a North Carolina home would need somewhere between 15 and 45 of those panels, and they're roughly this big, roughly 3 feet by 6 feet from the ground up to about here, to produce all of this electricity for a year. So an energy efficient house would need about 15, a much more energy using house would need more like 45 of those. And then I mentioned on those concrete pads is an inverter and a transformer that looks something like this. The transformer's really almost identical to what you would have outside of an apartment building or a big commercial space, changing voltages from the voltage at the street down to the voltage that the transformer outputs. In construction, the structures that hold up those panels, there's no concrete holding them in place. They're just driven into the ground 5 to 8 feet underground, and then there's 4 or 5 feet that stick out above ground, and the panels get bolted on top of that. You can see the dirt there. There's some trenching where you've got some underground conduits to collect all that electricity coming from the panels, take it to the inverter pads, and then from the inverter pads out to the street. That's a quick and dirty overview of what the technology is and how a solar farm is structured. I'll let Steve talk to you more about what's been installed and why.
Yeah, so I should ask this question before I show that slide. So who knows, if you were ranking the states, where North Carolina would rank in terms of solar installed capacity in the U.S.? Anybody know?
Number 2.
You are correct. Number 2, behind only California. Now, if you look, California is a pretty big wedge, and North Carolina is not that big. This is basically all the rest of the states not listed combined. So you can get some sense that we are a big player. California will be tough to catch. And this map shows a little bit about where the installations have been taking place. So solar's been interesting because it's actually been a pretty good economic development strategy for the state in rural portions of the state. The driver in a lot of these early projects in North Carolina has really been, where's the land flat and cheap? And if you go and look for flat, cheap land, the best place is between I-95 and one county over from Dare. And so you can see that in this heat map, that a lot of the activity is happening in these pink counties here. Now, this northeast corner of the state in particular has a little bit of extra bonus because you guys are under Dominion Power largely up here. And Dominion Power is regulated differently than Duke Energy and other utilities in the state. By being a part of Dominion's grid, you can actually take your power and sell it into markets all the way up as far as New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And so that's been an added bonus for a lot of solar companies, is to have greater flexibility in where they could take the power and do something with it. But you know, in all of these counties in the eastern part of the state, the economics have worked very well, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is, because a lot of it was driven by policy until recently. This graph shows, you can all read that, right? So this is cumulative renewable energy capacity since 1911 in the state of North Carolina. And you can see that most of this initially was all blue, that is hydropower. You can see the big spike here in the 20s when the TVA projects were being built to try and create jobs and to provide rural electrification across the southeast. Here in the late 40s, early 50s, you can start to see the beginnings of the pulp and paper industry in North Carolina, and a lot of the bioenergy that was being burned to generate electricity at plants coming in as this little green portion here. The red one is, let me think. The red one's more biomass. So really it was hydro and biomass right up until you get to about 2000, and what is that, about 7?
Probably 8.
Somewhere 2007, 2008. We passed a law in North Carolina in 2007 called the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard. And it basically said that electric utilities had to supply a portion of their energy from renewable resources. Basically, diversify your portfolio like any good risk manager should, right? And so that law started a discussion, and I'll talk about all of the other policies that were in place that made North Carolina really take off. But you can see we went from nothing in probably 2006 to all the way up here in 2012, or this is actually probably 2015. The little green at the very tippy top is the Amazon wind project that came in. That's the only significant wind project in the state. And you can see, even as big as the solar is, you can see how big that wind is and how big in the relative scheme of energy that wind project is. It's not a small project. It's the largest in the Southeast. It's the largest, it's one of the largest on the East Coast. But all of this solar and wind happened in a very, very short time frame. And clean energy in general has been kind of a big boon in recent years for the state of North Carolina. This is all numbers from the most recent, I think this is the 2016 Clean Energy Industry Census from the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association. They retain, I believe, RTI to do this study for them every year. But you can see that there's, in the overall picture of clean energy, there are over almost 1,000 companies in the state that are working in this space, almost 35,000 jobs. Just in solar, 23% of the revenue out of the state's $6.4 billion clean energy industry is coming from solar. And I can't remember the exact solar jobs number, but it's somewhere in the
5,000 or 6,000?
Yeah, I want to say it's just over 6,000 jobs, which means we certainly employ more people in solar in North Carolina than we do, for example, in the coal industry. Certainly more than we do in probably the natural gas industry. Well more than we do in the wind industry. Solar is actually a pretty big employer in the state. So what has driven all this? Well, a big piece of it, as I'll talk about in a second, was a policy framework that kind of all came together after many years of work in 2007, and some market structures that have evolved to create new ways to finance projects. But consumer support, if you do public polling on where do you want your energy to come from, solar and wind are consistently up around 90%. Other resources tend to come in down around 40% or lower. Scale, one of the biggest issues has been the dramatic global increase in production of solar energy. A lot of that was driven, frankly, when China, about the same time that we passed our renewable portfolio standard, right in the mid-2000s, China decided that they wanted to own the global solar market by basically undercutting everybody, and they dramatically ramped up production in China. If you were a manufacturer in the U.S. in the solar business, that was a pretty rough time because it dramatically depressed prices. But in North Carolina, we didn't have a lot of manufacturing in solar. In fact, we had only a couple of very small shops, and they're still around today for the most part. What we did have was a lot of interest in development. And so that dramatic dropping in solar prices, which between 2007 and 2010 was about a 70% drop in solar prices, and it's dropped probably about that again since then. Those drop in prices has made development much easier to accomplish because the prices have come down so far. So that's been a big plus. Only in the panels, although a lot of it is because of scale, you're seeing drops not quite to the same extent. A lot of the solar drops in the panels is also the manufacturing processes. But even in some of the raw material, more intensive raw material pieces like the racking, we've seen dramatic declines just because of the scale increase. So, aluminum and steel racking, the inverter technology, a lot of those things have not dropped as far as solar panels, but they have dropped and they continue to be on a downward trajectory. And a lot of that comes into this soft cost reduction piece as well. So that's not only some of the ancillary balance of systems pieces like racking inverters, but that's everything from training code officials so that if you've never seen this before, it takes a lot longer to inspect it than if you've seen them before. So training code officials, training installers so that people that actually have some experience in the technology can better install, more quickly install with fewer errors and fewer problems on site. All of those things are parts of the soft cost discussion, and the Department of Energy has made a real push to try and drive those costs down, and that's been very successful. And then this last one, technology convergence, is a big one. If you just look at what's going on in the utility sector and in the energy sector in general, we're kind of starting to go through something very similar to what happened in the telecom sector a few years back when everybody used to have rotary dial phones in their house, and you had a custom thing that you could only get from Ma Bell that is how it plugged into the wall. And about 1986, there was a bill that passed called the technology, it basically deregulated the telecom industry. And one of the things they did was they standardized that little plug and made it so that anybody could make it. And it opened the door to all kinds of competition coming in to make phones. You remember all of a sudden you could go to the drugstore and find a cheap phone that you could plug in for $10 when you used to have to spend $100 to get one from Ma Bell back in the day. Well, that emergence of technology kind of then morphed into the cellular discussion, and cellular became a direct competitor, and you saw this whole discussion about what was going on in that industry. And now you've got a computer in your pocket that has more computing power than the first space shuttle did, that allows you to do all kinds of things that no telephone was ever imagined to do just 30 years ago. And so that kind of technology convergence, where you're bringing together things like big data, kind of distributed generation, self-healing networks, smart technologies, sensors that are built into the system. You're going to have a refrigerator that's going to be smart enough to know when you go to the store so that it'll start to cool down, so that it'll be ready when you open the door to put your groceries in. It'll all be tied together. All these things are coming, and some of them I think are kind of silly, but there's business models to be built around them, and we'll see how that all works out. Something very similar is coming in this field, and it's all a part of that. You can see not only these in-the-house smart grid technologies that are going to make all of your appliances talk to each other and talk to your phone and kind of monitor what you're doing and how you're behaving, but you're going to, yeah, it's great, isn't it? But you're going to have the same kind of thing on the utility grid. You may remember, I can't remember, it was maybe about a decade ago, there was a major power outage in the northeastern quadrant of the United States, and it all started with a tree where a limb fell on one power line in Ohio, and it led to a whole series of cascading incidents that would be hard to replicate on somebody should have gone to Vegas that day or bought some lottery tickets. But those kinds of problems exist periodically because of the complexity of the system. And these technologies that are going to allow more distributed networks are going to be able to help us get around some of those problems and build networks that are more resilient, safer, particularly out here at the coast where you have an occasional weather incident. It's nice to have technologies that are going to be leading us in the direction of self-healing networks for our grid, so that if that tree limb falls, maybe the grid's smart enough to sense it and work its way around it so that everybody on the eastern seaboard doesn't go down anymore. So all of those trends have been driving a lot of this, but I will say that the biggest thing in North Carolina that drove it in the last few years has been policy. And there have been a number of them. And I will say this, I get questions about policy every now and then, and people say things like, oh, well, if it wasn't for all of these incentives, then the clean energy industry wouldn't exist. And yeah, okay, that's true. But if it wasn't for all those incentives, the nuclear industry wouldn't exist, the coal industry wouldn't exist, the natural gas industry wouldn't exist. Basically, in the world of energy, everything is pretty much subsidized out the wazoo. And so they all have their turn in the spotlight, if you will. And right now, renewables is kind of working its way out of the need for a lot of its incentives, which is something that I think a lot of the other technologies are having a hard time saying at this point. So what did we have? Well, in 2007, a bunch of things came together. One was a state renewable energy tax credit. It had been around for many years, since the 1970s, since the Jimmy Carter era, but it was restricted to a $500,000 per project cap, and so it was not useful for large commercial systems. Right around that time, I can't remember the exact year, but it might have been 2006, we changed that cap to $5 million instead of $500,000, and suddenly it was a big enough incentive to be interesting to investors. We also had the federal tax credit increase from a 10% commercial-only credit to a 30% credit across the board. Now that credit is now dropping again, and by 2022, that credit will drop down back to the 10% commercial-only credit. By the way, the state tax credit ended in December of 2015, so it's already gone. So what you're seeing here is the intent a lot of times of incentives in public policy is to drive a technology or drive some sort of economic opportunity forward, but you don't want to have to incentivize it forever. And what you're seeing here is in the world of clean energy, we're taking incentives away a couple at a time here, and the industry is continuing to move forward because it has kind of achieved that critical mass that was necessary, that the incentive was designed to help you reach in the first place. So along with the tax credits, another big piece was, this is a little technical, but there was a 15-year fixed-priced utility power purchase agreement. So basically, in 1978, a federal law called PURPA, the Public Utility Retail regulatory act, I'm going to say that's probably not right, but you get the idea. It was a law passed during the Carter era, basically to create more competition in energy markets, because at that time, a lot of our electricity in the U.S. came from oil. And Jimmy Carter was very concerned, obviously, about the oil crisis. And so the idea was to use PURPA and cogeneration, small factory-based kind of generation where you could use heat, to get more coal generation going. We wanted to get more coal as a federal policy. We wanted to get more coal into the system in the 70s because we had a lot of coal and we weren't held hostage by it, like we were with oil. But as a part of that, they also expanded it not just to cogeneration facilities, but also to renewable energy facilities, solar and wind. There weren't a lot of technologies that were very big at that point, but the idea was to at least open the door. So this state, every state had to implement that law, and there wasn't a lot of guidance on how to do it. This state took a particularly aggressive stance, and we said, we're going to give you a 15-year fixed price contract for systems that are 5 megawatts and smaller. You remember Tommy saying that the typical size was 5 megawatts? That's not by coincidence. That law basically said that the utility had to buy your electricity at a wholesale electricity rate, basically the price they would pay for the next electron they generated. And that rule was in place for a long time, but until all the other tax credits and other things that helped to make the financing work came into place, nobody cared. Right around 2007, that portfolio standard I mentioned came into place, the 15-year fixed price contract for these 5 megawatt systems, the tax credits all came together. There's also an 80% property tax abatement on the equipment. And so when you put all of that together, it was very attractive. And it made a lot of folks that were interested in doing investing, particularly the folks that invested for tax equity reasons. They were just looking for tax credits. That's, when I say people, that's big taxpayers like Blue Cross Blue Shield, Duke Energy, big institutional groups that are some of the biggest recipients of these tax credits. But their money was used to make solar happen, and it led to North Carolina becoming this very large solar state. Now, when you look at the list, the tax credit from the state is gone. The federal tax credit is working its way down. The 15-year priced power purchase agreement just ended. They just eliminated that in a piece of legislation that just passed about 2 weeks ago that Governor Cooper signed. It is being replaced with something different, which is basically going to drive the locating of solar projects away from developers and toward Duke Energy and Dominion Power. Basically, Duke Energy in particular is going to have to procure solar, and they're being told they're going to have to issue a competitive request for proposals now, but Duke can then specify where they want the solar. One of the things that's going to happen because of that is that all of these projects we've seen in the eastern part of the state are going to start moving west because Duke has expressed an interest in getting more balance to their grid. And right now there's a whole lot of solar in the east and not anywhere near as much in the west. And so the next batch of these projects is probably going to move in the western direction, just so you know. Where are we going? Well, this is House Bill 589 that I mentioned. It just got signed on July 27th. There were 30 stakeholder meetings with about 60 people in the room for these meetings to put this together. It's all, the sausage making is never any fun to watch. But it restarts what's called a green source rider program. So basically that says that if you're Apple or Facebook and you want to buy renewable energy for your facility, that you can enter into an agreement with Duke Energy, and Duke will make new renewable energy happen just to serve your plant. So they may not put it on your plant or next to your plant, but Duke will basically put it somewhere in the state on their grid and ship it to you. It formally legalizes the leasing of renewable energy systems. This is going to be one of the big things. As we've mentioned, all of this public policy really drove large utility scale projects until recently. This is the first crack that's going to really start to open the door towards rooftop systems. If you can have a third party come in and lease the system to you and basically sell you the electricity, that's going to change the dynamics of how rooftop systems work. Previously, if you look out in California or some of those other states that are on that map that have a more balanced market, you'll find that third-party sales of systems or third-party leasing is in place in most of those states because it allows companies to basically give you better financing products so that you don't have to spend $35,000 or even $15,000 on your own up front to put it on your house, depending on whether it's that 15 panels or 45 panels. And so this leasing program is basically going to mean that you don't have to do this big upfront cost. You'll be able to make a lease payment like if you were leasing a car or anything else. Another piece that goes with that is rebate program, which is going to be administered by Duke Energy for the next 5 years, although I'm betting that they will suck through this 100 megawatts a lot faster than 5 years. So if you're interested in rooftop solar and you live in Duke Energy territory in particular, which is probably not many of you, unfortunately, but just so you know, I would be looking around and seeing probably in about 3 months the rules are going to start to roll out from the Utilities Commission on these provisions, and that'll be the time to jump on solar before the rebates go away. It creates a community solar program, which Duke Energy, again, is the one that's primarily subject to. Dominion, because they're a smaller player, usually gets just exempted from a lot of these things in order to simplify the complexity of the legislation. So I would encourage you, if you're interested, go to the General Assembly website and you can read this legislation and figure out which ones Dominion's actually subject to. I don't know off the top of my head, but most of them they're not, unfortunately. But a lot of these things are going to change the dynamic in the state, and so it's probably going to spill over into Dominion territory anyway. But you probably won't see a utility-driven rebate program unless Dominion really gets told to do that by the Utilities Commission. In essence, what this does is it's going to change the dynamic of the market. It's going to basically double the amount of installed solar in the state over the next 4 years, or by 2022, so that's a little more than 4 years, 5 years. So we will continue to be one of the leading states in the country, but some of these provisions are going to start to crack the door open towards more residential and commercial rooftops, and that's a good thing to help start growing that part of the market. So just real quick, some of the positive impacts of solar. Economic development, there are jobs associated with these solar plants. They're construction jobs, so they're mostly on the front end. They're not, for the most part, long-term permanent jobs. There's a couple of operation and maintenance jobs that goes with solar farms, but it's not a big employer in the long term. There is some effort to try and cluster projects in an area where you can train a crew and rotate them through multiple projects to extend the life of a construction job, but in the end, they're construction jobs. Where it is beneficial is on the tax side. We do see a lot of investment that goes into communities, and particularly in some of those communities that we're talking about between I-95 and here, that are very economically depressed, that there has not been a lot of investment in of any kind in years. And when someone shows up and wants to spend $100 million on a solar project, even with an 80% property tax abatement, you're still looking at fairly significant revenue that's going to accrue to the county that wouldn't otherwise have. Plus, in many of the cases, that revenue is magnified because a lot of those counties, the land is in what we call the PUV program, the present use value program, which is basically a discounted tax rate for agricultural land. And when you put a solar farm on it, you're no longer agricultural. And so you come out of that program and the value of the property goes up, and so the tax revenue associated with the property goes up as well. So it's a net economic benefit to the county usually on the tax side. We do see some issues with this in counties where there aren't a lot of other jobs available. If you're a farmer and you've farmed the same piece of land for 5 generations and suddenly the landowner can get a better lease price from a solar developer than they can from you for growing crops on it, we do see the risk of some economic displacement there. And that's something that every county has to kind of weigh on their own as whether that's an issue that they can address or not. To address it, you're basically going to have to tell some landowner that they can't do what they want with their own property, and that's usually not a very popular outcome either. And so you kind of wind up in this ideological box where you can't figure out which is the more appropriate thing to do ideologically sometimes, but it's a piece of it. Yes, ma'am.
On page 4 of your handout, it says that the typical land leases are between $500 and $1,000 per year. That doesn't sound very much.
It doesn't, but most of the land leases for agricultural purposes in these counties are down around $125 to $150 an acre. And so, and it's a per acre deal. So a solar farm of 5 megawatts, that's kind of the typical, you're usually talking about at least 30 acres, something in that neighborhood. And so as these farms get larger, you get more and more acreage. Basically it's not a huge economic win for the landowner, but it's certainly a better economic outcome for the landowner in terms of the rents they're going to receive for their property.
And included in the cost of the lease is not the setup and decommissioning, right? That's the income that they get from the leasing of the land, the $500 to $1,000, is separate from the amount of
money that it would take to set it up in the first place and to decommission. That is not a burden on the landowner.
Typically, no. The way that decommissioning is a whole big conversation right now. And do we have we talk about decommissioning later?
We don't have a slide on it.
Not in great detail, so let me just address it now. Yeah, it is in this paper on the land use, the ag solar balance paper. So the big issue with decommissioning is that today, the materials that go into a solar farm are, as Tommy described, it's basically the kind of stuff that goes into cars for the most part. And a lot of those materials have a commodity value. That commodity value to be recycled. And so usually when a project gets built today, you look at the commodities that are in the site and you look at the recycled value of it, and the value of the recycled materials exceeds the cost of basically removing the site. And so the general idea is that right now, the money is basically there in the ground for you to pay for taking the thing out of the ground.
Taking it out of the ground, does that include reconditioning the soil?
It would in that scenario, in theory. Now, the problem is that these systems have a lifespan of 30 years, maybe more. And so what you don't know is what are those commodity prices going to look like 30 years from now? Because if you could predict that, you'd be doing a lot better in the markets than I am. And so what we have initially recommended at the center is that you should put in place what's called a decommissioning plan that kind of walks through all of these issues, basically captures the information about what the commodities are and what their value is, and that plan should be filed by the developer at the Register of Deeds so that it's a public record, and so that there's basically a public plan on how a project's going to be decommissioned. What we've started to look at now is that in and of itself may not be enough, and that we're starting to look at things like maybe that decommissioning plan should be updated by the project owner every 5 years so that there's a new plan filed, because a lot of times these projects change in ownership, and so the added bonus is that the county then knows who the current owner is on top of that. Even that may not be enough in some cases, and what I've started to see, now up until yesterday, I was telling people that I have never seen a project go forward where there was a bond required, some kind of upfront money put in, some kind of bond that would pay for that decommissioning later on. There were too many places where a bond wasn't required. If there was a concern about that and somebody wanted to require a bond, those projects usually just went elsewhere. What I've started to see just in the last few days, literally in conversations with developers, is that there are counties that have been attractive enough to do development that have put bonding requirements in place, that some projects are considering it. None have been built to my knowledge yet, but there's at least 3 or 4 projects I've heard about that are being discussed or under construction that will have a bond. But in most cases, that bond is structured not for the full price of removal, but for the price of removal minus the value of the salvage. And so if you structure I'm sorry this is very complex, but if you structure a decommissioning plan that has to be updated periodically, which means that they would have to update those commodity prices periodically. And the decommissioning plan basically says that if you fall below the value of the salvage, that you need to get a bond to cover the difference. That, to me, seems to be a much more thorough way of dealing with this problem. So up until recently, I will tell you that what we've advocated is just the decommissioning plan. But this question has come up in every single county that I've spoken in, and so it's become apparent that we needed to think about it more. And that's kind of my, at least, kind of state-of-the-art thinking on it after discussions with both county folks and with developers. Because if the restrictions are too great, the developers will leave. They'll go elsewhere and take their money with them. Some people might like that. Other people probably be sad about it. Well, that's right. It's got to make economic sense to them. But at the same time, it's got to make economic sense to the county, and it's got to protect and make economic sense to the landowner. And so trying to balance those interests, those are the kinds of things that we as NC State want to help folks think through. And so our job is not to answer the question, but at least to get enough good information in people's hands that they can think through these steps. So it's a good question.
The whole thing can be so risky. In reviewing the material here, and it's very comprehensive, so many of the comments have to do with what something should happen this way, and so it seems very tentative, like it's just being made up as you go along. it's a bit scary. And also the herbicides that are used and things like that to maintain the sites.
So
And what's the effect of hail on? There's a lot of questions.
most of the questions you just raised, there's actually pretty good data on, and we do have pretty good ideas of what the answers are, and I'll let Tommy address some of those in just a second when we get to some slides further in here.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's all right, but in general, what we have found is that for the most part, health and safety issues are not usually the biggest drivers of need for regulation or control, because these systems tend to be, they don't tend to be, they are very safe. The health and safety issues are not the driver in the conversation, and that's what I tell a lot of folks at the county level. Their focus in terms of things that need to be sorted out really should lie around a lot of these land use questions, because there are a lot of trade-offs, and those are the kinds of things, whether it's decommissioning or it's screening of the project so it's not as visible, or it's setbacks from schools or from neighborhood homes. Those are kinds of issues that really are more, I think, pertinent to worry about on the front end, because a bad decision can lead to a project that not only hurts a local community, but frankly hurts the industry in the state by creating a black eye. So with that, I'll leave it for that now. We can talk more later if you want, and I'll let Tommy answer some of the specific ones you just hit on. So just real quick, benefits. We talked about economic development. We talked about increased property tax. Without additional services, is worth noting, you have additional revenue that comes to the county, but these are not people that you have to go build a school for, or a police department, or a fire station. A lot of these projects, basically, it's additional revenue with no additional need to build roads or any of those types of things. So it's in a lot of ways, it's very good revenue to add to the mix. Improving energy security. We talked a little bit already about kind of the issues around resilience of the system and self-healing networks and things like that. You're starting to enable those kinds of outcomes. Local power generation. You don't have to ship or purchase fuels. We had an incident in western North Carolina a few years back where natural gas supplies got cut off by a hurricane, and we had a lot of heating problems in the western part of the state. You don't have those kinds of problems when you have local generation resources. You avoid those kinds of transmission issues. Reduces environmental risk of fossil fuels. We don't have any coal ash to deal with here. We don't do any strip mining associated with solar panels. Greenhouse gases are obviously mitigated by the creation of solar panels. And reduces electricity loss during transport, the line losses. Basically, these big, long transmission lines that you see, we lose a certain amount of the power just because of the heat that escapes as a part of the transmission of that power, and this helps to reduce that loss. If you look at the big charts that the Department of Energy puts together on total energy fuel-in output, a little over 60% of all energy that gets generated from fuel basically is wasted as heat or some other kind of loss in the system, and you really reduce that by having a lot more on-site generation. So all of those are pieces of the puzzle. So some common concerns, and I'll let Tommy deal with this, but I did want to just touch on this. There is a lot of confusion that's been generated, particularly in the eastern part of North Carolina, around some of these issues. We've seen people that have been out, basically just having a lot of information that's just factually not right. It's not always because of malicious intent. Sometimes it's just because you haven't seen it before. You're making assumptions and you haven't done the research. The technology has changed a lot very quickly. What was true 10 years ago in a lot of these technologies is not true today because of the pace of change and the nature of change. And so searching around on the internet for answers to some of these questions can lead you to a lot of information that's frankly just not right. And that again comes back to the mission of the university, and part of the reason that Co-op Extension exists is to try and help get good information in people's hands so that you can make the best decisions, whether you're a citizen looking to put something on your house, or you're a policymaker looking at a model ordinance, or you're a businessman trying to make decisions for your business. And so that's really our role. We're not here to tell you it's the right thing or the wrong thing. We're just here to give you the factual information so you can make that call yourself. So with that said, Tommy, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. And what we have planned in these next few slides is really just to introduce some topics of common concerns and then see where the questions go, then start to kind of move to questions and see which specific questions we have. So I will try to hit on a couple of your questions, but I may miss some of them, so ask them again in a minute if we don't cover them. The first topic here is health and safety concerns, which is something I've looked into pretty closely now for 3 or 4 years. Because we're hearing so many of these concerns and we understood the technology, but hadn't really looked into these questions directly at that time, but now we have. And recently published this paper, which is one of the two papers out there, Health and Safety Impacts of Solar Photovoltaics. That's really pretty comprehensive. It's a combination of in-the-state research and talking to various experts in the state, then also draws heavily on national and international academic research and published papers that have looked at these topics, and tried to put it all into one place. We went looking for this information and couldn't find it all in one single resource. There was a research paper on this topic or that topic, but not all grouped together in one resource. So that's available online. You can find it through the Clean Tech Center's website. There's a list of publications, and it's in that list of publications. And you've got a hard copy. So you can flip through that, and we can talk about any questions you have when we get to the question period here in a moment. But the summary is there's not a significant health and safety risk to the technologies being implemented. There are areas of potential concern, but they're really insignificant, or negligible is the word I was looking for. And we go into pretty good detail on that in the paper, and I'm glad to address any questions folks may have on that. Common aesthetics concerns. This is probably the most common concern, at least when I've dealt with this at the local county level, which is neighbors in the community not wanting the agricultural field or the open field or the trees to now be a solar system, and the aesthetics that go along with that, looking at the solar system instead of the field that was there before. And that's nothing I can defend in either way. It is a very different aesthetic than what that land was previously, and not everybody likes that aesthetic. You can minimize what it looks like or what you see by planting vegetative buffering around the perimeter, which is now required around a big portion of the perimeter of most projects and most jurisdictions around the state. It doesn't make it invisible, but it really minimizes the visual impact of the projects. The other two items on there, sound. There's some sound generated by the inverters, much less so by the transformers right beside them. I've been out at a lot of projects with my current job, and it sounds like a very loud outdoor air conditioning unit for a home. So if you're right beside it, it's very noticeable. By the time you get about 100 to 200 feet away, you can't hear it over the background noise. These are normally fairly internal to the system. If you remember the aerial photo before, those pads are usually pretty internal to the site. So at the perimeter of the site, you generally can't hear the inverter over just the rural, even in a really quiet rural setting, over that background noise. Glare, the panels reflect very little light. The only time you possibly could have glare is when you get sunlight hitting at a really glancing angle, which can happen in the morning and the evening. But in that situation, you've got to be looking generally at the sun to be in a situation where you may have glare reflecting off the panels. So the one time it might be an issue is right around an airport. There's over 100 projects now in the U.S. near airports. So they can go well with airports, but you do have to be careful. It is possible to have a situation where you could have a glare impact for certain hours of the year, certain minutes of the year. Common land use and land impact concerns. It's kind of two different general concerns here. One being just the transition of land that was previously agricultural or some other use being converted to a solar use. And then kind of at the end of the life of the solar, what has changed about that land because the solar project's been there for 20 or 30 or 50 years. And that's what this second paper deals with. Balancing agricultural productivity with ground-based solar, particularly the second half of that question of what are the impacts to the ground? Can the site be farmed as it was previously, assuming it was a farm site? There are still some gray areas there, some open areas open for discussion, but the short answer is, in agreement from all the experts that helped write this paper, is yes, that land can be farmed again after the end of the life of the solar farm. It will take some work to recondition the soil to get it back as productive as it was previously, but it's a very manageable amount of effort needed to get that soil back to the point you can produce crops as previously.
Tom, you want to touch on the pesticides question real quick? Or
That's
the
right,
herbicides,
pesticides
excuse me?
was herbicides. And I've learned since looking at this, herbicides are a subclass of pesticides. So an herbicide is a pesticide for a weed type of pest, which I had that confusion at first. I assumed pesticides meant animals and, but it means, yeah, herbicides are a pesticide. So I've interviewed probably a year ago now 3 landscaping companies that together were doing the vegetative maintenance on about half the solar projects in the state. So I can speak a little bit about what those 3 companies are doing, which are, I think, somewhat representative of how these are being, how the grass on these is being maintained. All those companies primarily mow. They all do some amount of weed eating. They also do some amount of herbicide use. And there was a range in how much they use between those 3 companies. One of the companies uses what's known as a growth regulator, where they spray it on all the grass, and it makes the grass grow slower, so they have to mow less often. The other 2 companies did not do that. That's something commonly done at golf courses. Golf courses often spray a lot of their turf with growth regulators, so they don't have to mow as often. All 3 used some common over-the-counter herbicides of Roundup or, what was it, 2,4-D. The 2 most common herbicides nationally to deal with different weed species in different locations and on the roads. But the way they explain it to me, and from talking to other agriculture experts at NC State, they're saying that it's no more than is what's used on row crops, and almost certainly it's a lot less than what's used on most row crops. And it's a very similar pesticides, and in most cases, less potential damage to other neighboring areas than most of the herbicides used, or than the herbicides that are used on row crops that are not used at solar farms. So there's a limited amount of data, but from my understanding, from talking with the various folks involved and the various experts, that the herbicide use at solar farms will have less impact on neighbors than the herbicides used at the majority of row crops. Row crops meaning corn, soybeans, tobacco, the common big agricultural crops in the state. Some are using sheep.
Not on this side of 95, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, I don't have to guess. Maybe 10% of the sites. I don't have that. That's not exact data, but just from what I've seen, there's quite a few sites around the state using sheep. Those sites are still doing some amount of physical weed control as well, but a big portion of the weed control or vegetation control is done with sheep on site. And those are generally done with local sheep farmers, basically leasing out the land to the sheep farmer to let them come in and put their sheep there for certain periods of the year. So they're not there year-round. They're there parts of the year. And often they're not just free roaming on the whole site. They've got temporary fences set up. They can better maintain the grass that way. They'll have them eat this area down and then move the fences so they go to the next area, and they don't overeat in certain spots that way. So kind of general policy questions of, Steve talked about the subsidies and policies in general. I can talk a little bit about grid impacts and how does this renewable energy or solar energy in particularly impact the grid. It does have the disadvantage of what the the utilities refer to as not dispatchable, meaning you can't control when it produces power. It's just whenever the sun produces power. But the utilities are already used to dealing with not knowing when the demand is going to be. The utilities have to produce power to match the electricity demand, and right now that demand, the utilities have no control over that demand. On hot days, there's more demand. Cold mornings, there's more demand. They can predict it to some degree, but they can't control it. Really, solar is identical to that. They can predict it to some degree, but can't control it. So it just means that other generating systems, particularly as natural gas plants, have to be flexible. They can ramp up and ramp down in their output when the sun comes and goes. Very similar to when people at home turn up or down their air conditioner or turn on and off lights. The utility's already ready to make those adjustments. This is just a different adjustment they have to make. And right now, with the amount of solar they have, it's very, very manageable. We can still put a lot more solar on. when it's still well within that range of flexibility the grid is already used to adjusting for. At some point, it gets to be a lot more complicated with enough solar on the grid. It's still very possible to keep running the grid, have high reliability with solar on the grid, but it does take additional changes to the way some of those generating plants are run. So I think changes are coming slowly, but the bottom line is the grid can still take a whole lot of solar and still function very well. And we've seen that in other countries where they've got a lot more wind. Germany has a lot more solar than we do, and they still have more reliable grids than we do, even with more solar, a lot more solar, a lot more wind. And that covers the gauntlet of the common concerns we've seen. And I'm glad to take more questions on other topics if there are some. This is some information for landowners. If you got landowners that are interested in leasing land out to a solar project or possibly selling land to the solar project. It's been most common for the solar developers to may have a long-term lease on the land. It's just kind of, we've been using that term lease a lot. But in some cases, the land is sold to the solar developer, and the developer owns the land the solar project's sitting on. These are 2 fact sheets. We don't have hard copies of these, but they're easy to find through the Cooperative Extension website that were probably written about a year ago by Cooperative Extension experts with a lot of guidance on to landowners on the possibility of leasing for a solar project. Specific lease terms, and then that one called threshold issues is referring to determining if your site might be applicable for a solar project. 2 very good fact sheets. This is about one of the last things we have here. Rooftop and community solar. Actually, I see it's already after 7, so I'm going to skip through this. We've touched on it a little bit. I can answer some questions about rooftop and community solar. But as you heard, this new legislation is probably going to make those markets grow a little bit, the rooftop markets, residentially and commercial. Community solar is having a large-scale utility system that, instead of just feeding that power back to the utility grid, is feeding it to some community, some subgroup of people that have bought into that project. So I don't know the specifics of what Duke Energy's program is going to be, but it'll be something like you can buy into this community solar project, and it means you will get the power coming off of a certain solar farm. These are some additional resources available from NC State. That's the website for the Cooperative Extension. If you go to the Cooperative Extension website, they've got a search bar there. If you search for solar, you'll find a number of fact sheets. Those 2 I mentioned for landowners, a number on taxation issues around renewable energy. If you go to the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, is where you'll find the 2 new white papers on health and safety in agriculture. And then that final link there, I've got it on this next slide as well at the bottom, is a project I worked on almost 4 years ago now to develop a template solar ordinance for North Carolina. This is just an example or model ordinance for cities or counties to consider as a starting point when they're adopting a solar ordinance to regulate solar in the jurisdiction. And these are just some of the parties involved in the working group. It was at least a 6-month process with 60 or 70 really pretty active parties involved to come up with this template ordinance. It focuses on the utility scale. Basically, it says in what kind of zoning jurisdictions is it appropriate to put solar, what permits should be required, what other requirements should there be on a utility scale solar, how far should it be set back from other properties, things of that nature. So that brings us to our conclusion, and thanks for the time. We have now gone a little past 7, but Steve and I are glad to stay as long as folks have questions. We're hoping to talk quicker and leave ourselves with some more time for questions, but we're glad to stay.
Just a housekeeping issue. If you leave us your email on the sign-in sheet, we'll be sure and get you a copy of this presentation so you can have the links and so forth. And also, you'll receive our newsletter, which comes out once a month at the beginning of the month and has all of our programs locally, and they're free. So, questions?
One of the things I noticed on the second to the last slide was the matter of homeowners associations, because in this area there are quite a number of communities regulated by homeowners association policies, and most of them are totally prohibitive of solar panels, and yet in this area there are very large houses which require a tremendous amount of air conditioning in summer when there is a tremendous amount of solar potential. And it would be so good if those communities would permit, say, an independent row of solar panels on the south side of a house. It would save the property owner a tremendous amount in solar. Have you folk got any way of articulating policy to deal with homeowners association rules? Have you come across this?
Did you work with Leaker on this?
No, I'm aware of it, but I didn't work on it directly.
Ann, did you work on that with Bob Leaker? Someone in our shop is an expert on this. It was Autumn. So there is a person in my shop that did some work recently on this topic because it is challenging. Homeowners associations are right up there with, fiefdoms and, electric cooperatives as kind of this independent governing entity that has limits on what you can do constitutionally too. There is some legislation that passed a few years ago, and as I recall, it basically said that new homeowners associations that were putting together their covenants, new rules, could not completely prohibit solar, that they would have to come up with some accommodation to allow solar. It might prohibit it in the front of the house, but would allow it in the back. And so then you get stuck with, what's the orientation of your house to the sun, and does it make sense to put solar panels in the front or the back? But it was a step in the right direction. There was no way, as I recall legislatively, to override existing homeowners association rule sets on that topic. That said, we do a lot of these educational briefings, and there's all kinds of new technologies that have come out recently to try and make these systems more aesthetically pleasing. You may have heard of the folks up at Tesla, and they bought Solar City that have this new roofing tile product. We won't see a lot of those products yet because again, the rooftop market is largely driven by price and not by aesthetic. But over time, that's going to continue to evolve, and we will see more products that are designed to try and overcome the concerns that are usually aesthetic concerns of the homeowners association. But if you got a homeowners association that's particularly problematic and they have a meeting and you'd like me or someone from the staff to come down and do a presentation for them and chat with them, I love excuses to come to the beach, and so I'm happy to do that.
And they're associated with that work Steve was saying. On the Clean Tech Center's publication page, there is a pretty recent guidelines on, I don't remember exactly how it's structured, but there is a document that describes the limits of homeowners' rules and some recommended guidelines for homeowners associations.
Mm-hmm. That's probably coming out of Autumn and Bob's work.
Yeah, that's already, I'm pretty sure that's already out. It's available.
Okay. Great. So there is a fact sheet on our website, and if you shoot me an email, and I think my email's up there, I can get that document and email it back to you if you're looking for it. Okay?
I have a couple other questions.
Sure.
Are the solar panels manufactured in the United States?
Very few are manufactured in the United States. There is one major manufacturer, First Solar, which makes a product that's manufactured mostly in Ohio and Arizona. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, a lot of the U.S. manufacturers were basically forced out when this first big price drop occurred. In fact, there's a major trade case going on right now at the federal level as to whether to start imposing tariffs on panels manufactured in Asia, particularly in China, to try and balance that out. The problem is that the company that filed that is already bankrupt, and so if that tariff goes through, all it's probably going to do is eliminate a lot of development by raising prices. It is unfortunate that we don't have a lot of manufacturing, but where I think the job potential in solar actually lies is in this discussion about rooftop markets. Rooftop installations tend to be smaller, and they tend to be more oriented towards the kinds of work that other types of contractors do, roofers, plumbers, electricians, those kinds of folks, local jobs that can't be outsourced to some other country. And so as those rooftop markets start to evolve, that's where I really see the job potential in this industry.
And they can do maintenance on it as well.
Absolutely.
Local jobs to people who do maintenance.
I mean, in general, with solar systems, there's relatively little maintenance, but if you're doing a lot of residential installations, you're going to create that same kind of steady workflow that you would in other types of industries where you might go once every 20 years to replace a roof.
What's the effect of hail on solar panels?
You can probably answer
Yeah.
that.
I mean, I have seen pictures of panels damaged by hail, but I talked to a lot of the solar developers. I haven't heard of it happening in North Carolina. So they're very durable. Most of them are tempered glass. Some are heat strengthened glass. It's slightly less strong than tempered glass. But they do have to pass, associated with their UL testing, some steel ball shots at glass that's meant to simulate hail of a certain size, and I don't remember what size, but maybe an inch to inch and a half hail.
Maybe
So
hunters?
Hunters they can withstand some shotgun pellets, but certainly a rifle would go through it.
Yeah.
Very rare to be damaged by hail.
Are the farms always agricultural, or do you deforest in order to put up panels?
That is really kind of a conversation between the landowner and the developer. I have heard of projects certainly where there was, particularly in kind of eastern North Carolina, where there's a lot of former pulp and paper forests, where there has been land cleared for solar projects. But in general, I would say that the industry tries to avoid those kinds of projects because it's added cost. And so the economics is really the big driver in a lot of these development conversations. So, they tend to avoid wetlands because that's complicated. They tend to avoid, having to cut down trees. But if a spot is, if it's right next to a substation and there's a place where it makes sense to put it, it is not unheard of for land to be cleared for that purpose. And, in a lot of cases, it's timber stands, not kind of hardwood or, old growth forests. But not always, I would guess.
North Carolina Department of Agriculture did a study at the beginning of this year. They looked at aerial photography of all the projects in the state, or 90% of them, and then looked back at older aerial photography of that same site to see what the land use was previously. I think there was some small fraction that was forested. The number I remember is roughly 80% was previously agricultural land, and then another 20% was a mixture of what they called scrub land, kind of undeveloped but not forested. There was some forested in there. So it's not unheard of to cut some trees down, but not
That
the
could
main.
affect weather and environment and other things too. And my last question is, that template seems like a really great idea for counties, but wonder, instead of making it available at your website, if you would proactively push that template out to each of the counties so they have it in hand. I've heard stories of some counties not being equipped to deal with the solar industry, and they got caught off guard and made some decisions they regretted when it was too late because they didn't have the information.
Yeah, the Association of Counties and the League of Municipalities here in North Carolina were both stakeholders in the development of that document. And when it was first published in 2013, they both basically did distribute it to their membership, and they continue to make it available on request for their members just as we do. I will say that the model ordinance was developed back in 2013, and one of the things that we've been talking about is that now that we've been at this a while, we've started to learn some lessons that perhaps it's time to think about updating the model ordinance to incorporate some of those lessons. One of the big ones that's come up recently is that we now have 4 projects proposed in North Carolina that will incorporate utility scale energy storage, basically big battery systems. And we didn't contemplate that because even 4 years ago, battery systems were prohibitively expensive. But as I mentioned, solar's on a cost curve that looks like this. Battery storage is on a cost curve that looks roughly the same, just 10 years behind schedule. And so battery technology is dropping precipitously in price now as well. And I think we're going to see more and more battery systems. And that brings up other questions that we've examined for solar, decommissioning, recycling, things of that nature, that we haven't really looked at in a very detailed fashion for storage. There are groups out there that have, and we'd like to learn from them and then incorporate that information into the model ordinance. Some of the other topics that we've talked about, this discussion we had earlier about decommissioning, to try and talk about a wider array of options for decommissioning plans versus, some kind of, limited form of bonding that wouldn't be cost prohibitive for a project but might give greater levels of security to a county. And then a third piece that we've been talking about a little bit is the setbacks discussion. Originally, I think the model ordinance called for a 15-foot setback with a 100-foot setback from residences. And we've been looking at that and wondering if perhaps those numbers need to be amended. There's one project in the state that, has been creating a lot of controversy because of its proximity to a school, for example. And so while, I got asked point blank this question in a meeting like this in a different county a few weeks back, would I have a problem sending my kid to a school if there was a solar array that was very close to the school? And from a health and safety standpoint, the answer is no, I would not. But from an aesthetics point of view, it might have an issue, and so therefore, I can understand why the school might not want a project right next door, and therefore, maybe that's something that the county should consider. And that's really all the model ordinance is a list of things for counties to consider when they set their policy. And what we tried to do in the model ordinance was address the things that we thought were legitimate to consider, and then we have a whole series of about 20 appendices attached to that document that address issues that we were kind of the opinion were kind of red herrings and that didn't need to be addressed. And so those appendices kind of talk about why they're red herrings. And we've learned a lot more about a lot of those issues as well, so we'd have more fresh information to incorporate into those parts of the document as well. Yeah.
One panel, how much does one panel weigh?
Could you repeat
30 pounds, maybe?
that? Could you repeat
Oh,
that?
sorry.
I'm sorry. One panel, what does it typically weigh?
In the neighborhood of 30 pounds.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know exactly, but something like that.
And on a typical 5 megawatt
yep.
farm, how
About-
many panels are there
About
roughly?
20,000.
20,000.
Yeah.
Cool. And how large is that? What's the acreage of a typical one?
Typically, it's about 6 acres?
Oh, about 6 acres per megawatt. Yeah, it's about 6 acres per megawatt. So 30. I've seen them as small as 25 acres. I've seen them as big as 40 acres.
Yeah, one question that comes up in this context periodically is this issue of disposal of panels. There's a lot of concern about the size and scale. The reality is that, the EPA has been kind of certifying panels for, how they should be disposed. Are they hazardous waste? Are they not? Right now, the vast majority of, I think all panels that I'm aware of, at least that are commercially available, are certified by the EPA to go straight to landfill. So you could do that. But as we talked about, the vast majority of that material is pretty standard recyclable. And so what we see in Europe, which is a little further down the curve than we are, is that entire recycling industries have built up around the kind of end of life of these types of systems. And in a lot of cases, the recycling of those materials is very beneficial to the industry, particularly this company that I mentioned that is a manufacturer in the US, First Solar. They don't use the typical silicon technology. They use something called cadmium telluride. Cadmium telluride is a material that can be easily recycled back into new panels. And so First Solar actually doesn't even sell its product unless you sign an agreement that you're going to return the panels at the end of life to them because they want to recycle it. They have their own recycling program. So it's a concern when you start doing the math. If you matched it to, say, cars, it's not that big of a concern, but it is, or if you start looking at the amount of concrete that goes into traditional, scale power plants, there's always trade-offs in life. But this is one that we feel is pretty manageable, and assuming that economics works the way it should with the laws of supply and demand, we would anticipate that a recycling industry would emerge to basically specifically focus on this industry as we move forward. So, the economist in me says it's not a tremendous problem as time goes by.
I'll just clarify that. Though, we're not able to really deeply recycle those panels now, but we can deeply recycle most of the rest of what's on the site, which is common building materials. Right. It's copper wire, aluminum wire, steel and aluminum racking. And then even the inverters and transformers are mostly big steel boxes with big pieces of copper in them. So it's really only the panels that are the question of how well can you recycle them.
And the materials in a panel are, it's glass, plastic, aluminum. There's some traces of other things, but
Tiny trace amounts of several metals, and then fairly small amount of silicon. Silicon being the second most common element in the Earth's crust, so super common material, silicon, or at least element. Usually it's combined with oxygen to make silicon dioxide, which is sand and quartz, is where the silicon comes from.
take the microphone.
In one of the earlier parts of the presentation, it was noted that, in fact, the silicon panels are only 20% efficient. And you mentioned cadmium a few minutes ago. Mm-hmm. Is that the material that may become the dominant production material for solar panels? Or is there another material emerging?
I can talk about that there. And I was oversimplifying it to 20%. There are some that are 20% or higher. Most are more like 16 or 17%. The cadmium telluride now is about 17%, so really about the same as the silicon. And they've been running neck and neck in terms of costs and efficiencies for a couple of years. There's a lot more silicon in the market and in use in North Carolina, in the U.S., and worldwide than the cadmium. It's possible cadmium could take over, but it seems more likely silicon will continue to be the dominant. There's lots of other technologies under development that right now just aren't economically feasible, but have the possibility of being either a lot more efficient or a similar efficiency and a lot cheaper. But it's all to be determined to see how well the technology can develop.
Yeah.
But it's still, the present silicon panel technology is still making a major contribution to energy production.
Correct. And maybe that sounding like a low efficiency sounds like a bad number. It just means you need a little more area. The traditional fossil fuel power plants are about 30 or 35% efficient. So of the energy in that raw coal or natural gas, you get 30 or 40% of it out in electricity. So it's relative, yeah. Right. And here we're starting with sunlight that we have as much of as we want. So it's a percentage of that. So it's really just impacts how much land do you need and the cost. And that's the bigger problem.
Yeah. While they wait for those batteries.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Real quick. I was delighted and surprised to hear that North Carolina was number 2 in production of solar. I'm like, wow. How much of our energy is produced that way?
It's about 3%. Well, that's what's expected this year. I mean, we've been growing so quickly that until very recently, I was saying 2%, but now the newest expectations for 2017 is about 3%.
Yeah, that renewable portfolio standard I mentioned says that we have to get 12.5% from all renewables by 2021. It's not the most ambitious goal in the world, but if you figure where we started from, it's actually quite impressive. But if you look around the country at other states that have renewable portfolio standards, many of those states have been ratcheting that number up. And so Hawaii recently, Hawaii's a little bit of a special case because they have to basically truck all their fuel out there on a barge, and it's all diesel generators for the most part. They're going to go to 100% renewables by, I want to say, 2030. California has put I believe it's 100% by 2050 in place. Don't quote me on the numbers. There's a map on our website you can find that has all of the states, but our number was very impressive. And if you look at the map around the U.S. of renewable portfolio standards, we're the only state in the Southeast that has one. No other state in the Southeast has one. There's a goal in South Carolina that's non-binding. There's a goal in Virginia that's non-binding, and there's nothing else in the region. So ours is still impressive, especially in the context of the Southeast. But, it's not the cutting edge nationally or internationally at this point as we work its way up. Okay. Well, thank you guys all so much. Again, thanks to the local co-op extension folks and to the county for putting up with us tonight and helping us out with facilities. And, if there are other questions around this solar topics or other renewable energy topics that you guys are interested in, please do let co-op extension know and they can let us know, and we're happy to come back again and do it. So if you have other topics that you're interested in, don't hesitate to ask. That's why we're here, and we're glad to do it. Thanks a lot. Okay.